So my plan today is to give you a little bit of history and have some fun. Because this technology ride, which has created today's optical internet, has been a fascinating and exciting one. And I'm going to try and share that with you and tell you some of my heroes. And I'm also going to talk about what comes next. Nobody's got a monopoly on being able to predict. I'm going to give it a shot, and I will almost certainly get it wrong. And I hope that we'll be able to discuss this in the discussion session. I really welcome your ideas. So, with that said, what you're looking at here is actually another use of the optical fiber altogether. And I'm going to show you how that connects. That is being marked with a fiber laser. So I'm going to talk first about the development of the optical fiber for the internet, and then I'm going to talk about some really fascinating stuff for the future in ultra-high power lasers. So with that said, let me start to introduce you to some of my heroes, all of whom I know well. Charles Townes, who invented the laser and got the Nobel Prize in 1964 for it. Optical fiber, Charles Cow, another Charlie, 2009. And Vint Cerf for the Internet Protocols, who happens to be my deputy chairman for the Marconi Society. Sadly, Charles Townes passed away at the age of 99, if I recall, just a year or so ago, and he was still supervising PhD students. When I saw him last at the celebration for the 50th anniversary of the laser, he said to me, Dave, he said, I've got to stop supervising students. I don't think I'm going to survive them. Wonderful man. Charles Cow worked in the UK, and classically, and I'll show you how this happened, invented the optical fiber as a means of communication. Sadly, Charles today has very serious Alzheimer's and doesn't go out. But I did see him a couple of years back, and he barely recognized me, sadly. Vint is, of course, very well known, I assume, to all of you, because he gives the most amazing talks, and he is the internet evangelist for Google. And of course, we have another person that we need to honor, and that is James Clerk Maxwell. And widely regarded as one of the greatest three scientists that have ever lived, for unifying electromagnetic theory. And those are his famous equations, or infamous, as many students would have it, when they try to learn what they mean. An absolute genius of a man. The other two, normally in most people's lists, are, of course, Albert Einstein, who often credits some of his work to James Clerk Maxwell, and Isaac Newton. So that's what it's all about. And James Clerk Maxwell, of course, is the person that realized that we could predict the way that optics, light, radio waves actually work. And so this is dedicated to him. But let's start where it all started. So back in 1858, the normal way of communicating was by sending a ship or a messenger. Not very fast. What was tending to happen in those days is, Britain ruled the waves, and of course we would send messages, and the events would be over by the time the message arrived, and the battle had been won or lost or whatever. So not great. So one of the huge, huge things, and I give this talk a lot to young people, right, who are just used to using their phones. Of course you can talk to America anytime you like. But back in 1858, this is what we had to do. And the enormous effort, and they tried 7 times, and the cable kept breaking when they tried to put it across the ocean. But eventually, in 1858, they inaugurated the transatlantic telegraph, 4,260 kilometers, Morse code at 1 bit per second. Right? I worked out how long this would take to actually send this message, which is what Queen Victoria sent. May the Atlantic Telegraph prove to be a bond of perpetual peace and friendship between the kindred nations, and an instrument destined for divine providence to diffuse religion, civilization, liberty, and law throughout the world. Boy, was she wrong. Well, actually, she was right, but what she had failed to realize is that there's always some bad guys out there, as we have just recently seen in the news. So, it was recognized that this would change the world, and indeed it did. But you might be asking yourself, why did we end up with using light? Well, actually, the most obvious way of communicating is with light. And let me give you an example. So I went through the literature, and I figured out, this is the oldest reference that I could find, 458 BC. You don't see many scientific references to that, right? And this is actually from a play written by Aeschylus. It was called Agamemnon. So this was the fall of Troy. So here we have the Aegean Sea, and here is Troy up here. And this is what it says in 458 BC. Here's what actually was said. So this was to Clytemnestra, formidable-looking lady. What time of day was it when Troy was destroyed? Clytemnestra, not day, but at night. Last night, in fact. So how did she know? And the news has arrived already. How could that happen? At the speed of light. Hephaestus' sacred fire blazed from beacon tower to beacon tower, from Ida's top to Lemnos, and from there to Athos, that island sacred to Zeus, and so on. Now that was an incredible and extraordinary achievement. So we went back to think about these, and we said, well, we know a lot about light these days, so we can analyze what it took to do that. So here is the root. And so we then calculated that this was the first free space optical link transmission of 600 kilometers. The longest span is 150 kilometers. It was 1 bit per night. And it would have taken a 5 to 10 meter woodpile fire to be visible over that distance, which is tens of megawatts of power that was being dissipated. It shows you how desperately they needed to communicate. And too bad if it rained. So you can see, my point is that light was always the way. And in fact, there are many examples. So here's another one. Of course, this is the Red Indians, and I've called this system the Light and Smoke Emission Regulation System. And here's another version, the Ice Smoke 5S. Clearer signals with a smaller blanket and longer lasting. But okay, so there are many examples, in fact, throughout the Napoleonic Wars that we developed the semaphore concept, and scattered all over the UK are telegraph hills. You know why they're called that? Because they used to have receivers on the top of those hills. And they would detect, as we got more sophisticated, we started to develop coding and semaphore, and then we could actually go from hilltop to hilltop. And from Portsmouth to London, the Navy could communicate with the Admiralty. So it was not too much of a stretch to figure out that we should be using light, but nobody could figure out the light source. We didn't want to build these 10-meter high log piles. We had a detector, so what we were waiting for, in fact, was the laser. And along comes my hero, Charles Townes, and develops that. Here is a patent that was written in 1958, because as soon as the laser was invented, people could see that it now had most of the components. So this particular patent is for a communication system for operation in the infrared, visible, or ultraviolet regions of the electromagnetic wave spectrum, comprising a monochromatic maser. They hadn't invented the word laser yet. And so you can see what it says. A maser amplifier. All our words are changed. So here's the little diagram. And it's pretty obvious to everybody that what you must have for any communication system is a transmitter source. This applies just as well if it's radio, or microwaves, or your mobile phone. A modulator to impress the signal, a detector to detect it, and a transmission channel. That's the problem. Now, you get away with it for your mobile phone because you're using the air. But guys, don't think that wireless can do this. All your mobile phone does is it goes to the nearest tower, which is usually just a kilometer or two away, and then it goes on optical fiber to the next tower. So the final drop is the only thing that's actually radio. And who's satisfied with the bandwidth that you get from your wireless phone anyway? Let's not go there. So what we were missing was the transmission channel. So people thought you could do this in free space. I mean, here's an example, right? But what happens if it rains? And it turns out that when you try and send a beam like this over any significant distance, atmospheric turbulence, birds flying through it, who knows what it is, and it's not a practical way. People did try, but it just doesn't work. So what we were waiting for, of course, to replace all these telegraph, early optical French version. The French were very sophisticated and elegant in developing these ideas because they have rather better weather than we do in the UK. So across France, and here is one, on the Littermont near Nalbach, is a sophisticated tower with all these arms, and operators used to sit in here and move the arms and so on. But we needed the genius of Charles Cowell. And in fact, next year is the 50th anniversary of his famous paper. And I am proud to say that I am being asked by a number of people to give a talk on his behalf, to explain the early days of how all this stuff happened when he, Charlie, and I were working, me in Southampton, with others, and him in STL laboratories in Harlow. So, what Charlie recognized is something that might be obvious to you. Glass is transparent. That's why we have windows, right? Now, the thing that nobody really knew was how transparent is glass. Now, Charlie was an evangelist. He just loved this stuff, and he swore that it could get the losses down low enough. How did he know? Nobody knew. So what I've done here, interestingly enough, is Charlie wasn't able to know this at the time, but this is the distance that you could get through a chunk of glass. So a 100-kilometer thick chunk of glass, it happens that we would get 1% of the light through. And it turns out that 1% of the light for typical laser power and so on is enough to be able to detect quite easily. So he didn't know this, but look how kind nature has been to us. This tiny little band in there that's got this incredible transparency. So Charles wrote a paper which says, a fiber of glassy material represents a possible practical optical waveguide with important potential as a new form of communication medium. That kind of insight and belief, important word there, belief, that we could do it, is why he got the Nobel Prize. So let's take a look at that a little closer. So, of course, the marketing guys get into it straight after. And this was written in 1966, which is around when I started to work with this. And it's an STL press release, which has a 10 to the 4-fold miscalculation throughout. Fortunately, all in the wrong direction. So let's have a look at just exactly what the environment was at that time. So talking about fibers, they have exhibited an information carrying capacity of 1 gigacycle. Well, for a start, it should be a gigacycle per second. And today, a single fiber can carry about 10 terahertz. Right? Unbelievable figure. And it is capable of carrying 10 milliwatts of power. Today, it can carry about 30 kilowatts of power. And finally, the best readily available low-loss material has a loss of about 1,000 dBs per kilometer. In other words, unusable. Right? So you kind of wonder what the marketing department was smoking at this point. But Charlie carried on anyway and started funding people. We started up in Southampton. And when I was a young student, my professor said to me, Dave, I want you to build a fiber drawing tower, make ultra-low-loss fibers, and put fibers around the whole world, and we'll have a thing which we hadn't even invented the word internet then. So I said, with the arrogance of youth, or the ignorance of youth probably, well, I'll do that, no problem, because I'm an engineer, I can do this stuff. How far can we get through at the moment? And he said, about that far. Right. Not going to make much of an internet out of that, right? So, here's the history of optical glass. Egyptians developed some very sophisticated glass technology for ornaments and containers. And the Venetians finalized that, and even today Venetian glass is famous. And then a very important period here, around the 1900s, when Otto Schott and Carl Zeiss in Jena, in Germany, developed all of the optical technologies that we know today. And those names still persist as examples of quality. So here's when I turn up. Now that is actually me. And I could say that it was only through my efforts that happened, but that would be something of an exaggeration. But this was led in the UK. Our American friends eventually got into these, the famous Bell Labs, and Corning, of course, probably the world's greatest glass company. And this is what happened over the period. And for a period in my PhD time, I had the lowest loss fiber in the world, and this was the only way it was available outside of corporate labs. And you wouldn't believe the number of visitors that we used to get, because they could see that it was just an incredible breakthrough, that you could set up a drum of fiber, which we'd made in our own labs with really crude technology, and we could put a laser in one end and kilometers out of the other. You'd get light. And we demonstrated this on Tomorrow's World back in I'm trying to remember exactly when it was, in the mid-70s. Actually a live television channel. We put the whole of the BBC out through a fiber, and people got really convinced at that point. So this is from the source of City of Light. And there was another problem. So fast forward a bit. So now we've got optical fibers which have gone industrial, and you could make thousands and thousands of kilometers. Now, here's another thought. So by the middle of the 80s, we had optical fibers made through a process which we developed at Southampton, and Corning also developed in Bell Labs, using vapor deposition, which is how you got the purity that you needed. So we stole it from the semiconductor guys, actually. And we now were able to make the world's most perfect waveguide, as anticipated by James Clerk Maxwell, with a bandwidth of potentially terahertz. They didn't know that at the time, which is enough for many tens of thousands of broadband channels. We could make it so that we could get through 100 kilometers, and we could make it cheaper than the price of a piece of spaghetti. This is just unbelievable. It'd been vastly cheaper than copper. So you might ask, why is your DSL system, ADSL into your home, still copper? There's another story there, which maybe we'll discuss later. I'll get myself in trouble if I'm not careful. But there was a problem. So what we needed to do now was to amplify it. because 100 kilometers, well, that's okay in the UK, but it doesn't get you across Australia or the oceans or anywhere else. So what we needed was an amplifier. And if you put in an electrical amplifier, this is the original slide produced by STL, by the way. So this is where we were in the mid-80s with incoming light, and you had to detect it. You had to pass it through what was called a 3R regenerator, and then you had to remodulate it and go out the other end. So this was rather like pay toll on a motorway. So you really wanted to do this. So we came up with the idea that what we could actually do was create an amplifier inside the fiber. And that's, as we heard in the introduction, is what was called the erbium-doped fiber amplifier. And what a lot of people ask me about is, how did we come up with this? Because it was a sensation. It solved the problem. And it was really interesting because, I tell this to my students. You often don't know when you've hit a breakthrough because it never looks that way. What it looks like is, a lab full of expensive equipment and a piece of stuff that's working, but you're sitting there scratching your head and saying, how the hell are we ever going to commercialize this? You're taking 100 kilowatts of power from lasers to pump it and so on. So was this an overnight sensation? It shows you the blindness. And I don't often tell this to people, but here's actually how it was developed. So back in 1985 in Venice, we said, the broad fluorescence line width of rare earth ions in glass allows the construction of broadband amplifiers for use in wavelength division multiplexing. Wavelength division multiplexing, I'm going to tell you what that is in a minute, was not even thought of at that time. Fiber amplifiers certainly weren't thought of. We'd only just published fiber lasers, but that's what we said in our paper. We then proceeded to publish 24 erbium-doped fiber publications for sensors, lasers, and all the rest of it, before we finally figured out that why don't we just take the mirrors off, because lasers always have feedback. And we took the mirrors off to make an even simpler device, and we discovered and announced it in 1987 in Reno, high-gain rare earth doped fiber amplifier, 1.54 microns, which is the lowest loss region into fiber. At the same time, we said in 1986, as a power amplifier, the fiber device could have advantages over the bulk glass systems by reducing the problems of thermal distortion and thermal fracture. 1986. We were just guessing. It seemed like a good thing to say. I'll show you the implications of that. Because when I look back through these old papers, I said, how could we be so blind and not immediately rush out, patent the hell out of this and start 10 companies? Well, it takes time to develop these things. Because what the fiber amplifier did is, if you stay in the optical regime, it's agnostic to color. Right? It's an amplifier so that all the colors can go through it. So colors in optical communications are a bit like radio channels. So when you spin your dial, you pick up radio 1, radio 2, radio 3, whatever. These are just because they're different frequencies. Well, when you go into the optical regime, you do exactly the same thing. You spin the dial and you pick up different colors. I say colors, that's a bit of an exaggeration because they're very, very closely spaced wavelengths. Right? So because the amplifier just amplifies all these simultaneously, you could do this. You could have lots and lots of little lasers, all combined together, all carrying a different channel. You could send it down the same amplified system. You split out all the colors at this end, and you got a multiplication of thousands of times of the bandwidth of the fiber. And this was just caused a sensation, and it caused the great boom. I often get blamed for that, by the way. Somebody has to be blamed. The great boom and bust in telecommunications, which happened in 2000, which is, of course, when I went out and started a telecom company. Not smart, right? Well. So here's the implications of this, and I love to show this one because it shows the incredible arrogance, to me, of engineers. So we've got this skinny little fiber that's about the thickness of your hair. What are we going to do with it? And we've now got an amplifier. What are we going to do with it? Well, we're going to stick it across the Atlantic. Of course we are. Phew. So this is what it looks like when it actually gets out there, whoops, into the real world. So that's that amplifier. Didn't look like that in our lab, I can tell you. So the next time that you access somewhere in Japan or the US and pull down a video or pictures or the news or whatever, give a little thought to those thousands of engineers that made all that possible and just said, we'll string this stuff around the world. No problem at all. We'll give you huge amounts of video channels. We will string this stuff all the way around Africa because we don't want to put it through the land. It's cheaper to put it around the outside. And we will slowly penetrate into darkest Africa. And I particularly like this slide because I was brought up just there. And there's no internet there yet, but it's coming. It's coming. So in combination then with the final drop, so places in the in like India and Africa, they don't have fixed line telephones. They can't understand the concept. Everything is mobile up to the nearest tower, and then it's cable the rest of the way. So here then, I hope I've convinced you, with the phases of the optical internet. Charles Towns here for the laser, and then comes Charlie with the optical fiber. These guys who are often credited with some of the very earliest technology, the vapor phase concepts, Keck, Maurer and Schultz. Pete Schultz works with me still. And these guys here who did the fiber amplifier, our labs, and then the development work from my old friend Randy Giles here and Emmanuel de Sevilla, who, as I say, are very close friends still. So we now have 100 million kilometers or so, 50 terahertz per fiber, enough for 25 million broadband channels. Everything's wonderful. So unfortunately, you guys are using it, and you're using it too much. So we have to grow because, you know, there's this philosophy which says, give people technology, they will use it, so make it profligate. Make it so you don't care how you use it. And we all do it. You reply to an email, you send the original back again, right? It's unbelievably inefficient, but you don't care. So it's very important to have technology which is usable. So here we are, telecoms, the laser, the fiber, the amplifier, to that wavelength division multiplexing stuff. What comes next? Are we at the end? Is that it? Are we all going to get capped? Suddenly you discover, oh, well, you can't get on the internet today, or you can't download something because your neighbor's doing it. Well, actually, that happens anyway. But that's not a fault of the technology, that's the fault of the supplier. So here is where we are today. Millions of kilometers of fiber per year, 180 million kilometers per year being installed. Remember, this stuff costs less than a piece of spaghetti. It's digging the holes that's the problem, right? So the question then remains is, how much is there going to be growth? So here's an interesting quote. It would take an individual more than 5 million years to watch the amount of video that will cross global IP networks each month in 2018. What are you guys watching? So, yeah, what's next? And this is the white hot topic today. I just got back from the world's #1 conference in California on this. So we are running out of capacity. Every time we now go to these conferences, we kind of, the improvements are minimal. So is this going to happen? Let's not go there. So here's the very latest, greatest thing, and I'm very excited about this stuff. Perhaps the Greeks were right. Glass isn't actually good enough. So could we make a fiber with a hole in the middle so that it's not going through the glass, but it's still contained? Because we know how to do that. With this clever structure out here, it's what's called a kind of a Bragg structure. And actually our latest ones are even cleverer. We just had the post-deadline, which is the gold standard in my field in California, on a system which is not, it's called an anti-resonant waveguide, which has got a huge hole in the middle and breaks all the rules. Now the losses are nowhere near where they should be, but we may be able to produce a fiber which is not using glass in the middle. And that will be a huge, huge advantage. So these are some of the things that they look like. We can make this stuff still for the price of a piece of spaghetti. With this structure in here, you see all these holes in the middle. It's a very clever design, and I won't bore you with exactly how you do it, but there is one of them. So here's the little hole in the middle here. And we're suddenly, the other thing about innovation and radical change, disruptive change, is you will get opposition. And we ran a special session in California, and the audience was almost entirely hostile to any of these new ideas. But after we'd gone through it all, we had a vote at the end. There was about 400 people in the room, and there was sort of limited acceptance that maybe there was some special applications where this stuff would be useful. And actually, the answer is in high-speed trading. Computer trading these days relies on getting your bid in first. So if you put in an optical fiber, because of the refractive index of the glass, it travels about 30% slower than a radio wave. And if you make a hole in the middle like that, it doesn't. So there's a huge amount of interest from the trading houses because it effectively gets them 30% nearer to the stock exchange, right? For which they will pay almost anything. So let me switch now to this same incredible fiber technology. Let me introduce you to some new heroes. So here is Theodore Maiman, the first working laser in 1960. He didn't get the Nobel Prize for it, but he made the first one. He was an engineer working in Hughes. Eli Snitzer, old friend of mine, who actually made a fiber laser wrapped around a flash lamp in 1964. Not very practical. And Charles Kao, who introduced us the concept of silica, which is a wonderful high-temperature material that is incredibly robust and strong and all those good things. And these guys that you already know for the fiber amplifier, and where should this lead us? But we asked the question. Famously, I got a phone call from DARPA, the American Defense Funding Organization. How did that happen? And they said, you know, Dave, you've been talking about these fiber lasers for ages. How much power could you get out of a fiber laser? And I knew this guy had money. So I wondered, what would be attractive to him? And I said, a kilowatt. He laughed. He said, don't be silly. And he said, how much would that cost? And I said, well, it's only a matter of money, isn't it? And he said, well, I got some money. How much is it going to cost me? And I just said, $5 million. He said, done. And I thought, what have I done? Within 1 year, we had 2.4 kilowatts out of a fiber. And that just stunned the world, because what this is just taking the same idea that drives the internet that I've introduced you to. A seed laser, amplifiers, 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 only now it's all in a box. And we don't just compensate the loss of the fiber, we actually increase it through each stage. And this is what one looks like, doesn't look anything like a laser. And this is what it can do. Or this is real time. A revolution in manufacturing. Now the interesting thing about this, and why I'm showing it, is because this is faked, obviously. How do I know that? Look how jagged that is. And you also notice it's red. Real lasers don't work at that in the visible at all.
But he knows what I know. You've done nothing, Mr. Bond. Operation Grand Slam, for instance.
That's what it really looks like. See how straight it is? Now today we can cut through exactly that thickness, an inch thick steel, by using one of our fiber lasers. And the way that they did that was they had a guy underneath with an oxy-hydrogen burner. But here's another example. This was cut just a couple of weeks ago in my company. This is real time again. That's speeded up now. Okay, but I actually have this now on my wall. And you will see it in a moment, because it's huge. And that's our famous light logo, of course. But look how big it is. So we can cut, it only depends on the size of the platen now. This is something like 3 meters by 3 meters. We've done one 4 times that big now. Let's just cut in real time. So a revolution, because these things are all in fibers, it's all in a box, and they're tiny. So they're not much bigger than a few laptops stacked together. They're not like anything that you'd have heard of before. And so the world is taking this off. Your iPhone's manufactured that way. What happens in the next iPhone comes in, the laser company that we're working with in China gets an order for 100 lasers overnight to be shipped 1 week later. So let me just give you a few crazy thoughts, because this is unbelievably revolutionary, this stuff. Because there's another fact that people are only just getting their minds around. That is, you can go parallel. Because this stuff is made by the same way that we make the internet fibers. So we can draw 10 lasers a second in manufacturing. So for the first time, you've got a laser medium that costs less than a piece of spaghetti. So what does that mean? Aha! So for the first time, why don't we do this? So we just take our idea, we split up the power, and we make an array of lasers. So we parallel them up. And we're really clever. We combine the beam back together again because it's coherent, which we can do. And we have inbuilt adaptive optics to get rid of the turbulence in the atmosphere by taking feedback from our target. And we can steer it by just changing the phase. This is a radar technique, by the way. This is exactly how they do radar. But now it's optical. And it's megawatts. So where should that lead us to? Well, who is interested? The photon dome, you heard of the Iron Dome? There's a huge amount of defense work going on. Fortunately, it is a defensive weapon because you can take out incoming missiles or even rocket-propelled grenades. But at the same time, there are other applications. Weapons of mosquito destruction, which is actually being funded, would you believe, by the Bill Gates Foundation. Right? So what's the idea behind this?
Are you through with mosquitoes? Are you fed up with mosquito bites? Are you tired of being chased away from your garden or go hunting in the middle of the night? The Crowan Brothers present the Starburst Mosquito Defense System, a unique system which destroys mosquitoes with a laser beam before they land on your skin. The system is very easy to install. First, mount the mirror satellites to the wall. Put the main station anywhere you like, on a table or on a cupboard. Once you've activated the main station, the system works automatically. The mosquito is now in the red circle. Watch carefully. The Starburst Mosquito Defense System does its job while you read the paper in your garden. Because of the 4 cooperating mirror satellites, there is no spot at all where the mosquito is safe. I was bitten so many times by the mosquitoes that both my legs had to be removed. I turned hysterical and tried to kill my children. Since I have begun to use the Starburst Mosquito Defense System, I'm so happy. My legs have grown back and I have many new friends now. Do you recognize this? Chasing mosquitoes with a newspaper or a fly sweater? Bloody stains on the wall? Waking up in the morning with 20 mosquito bites? The Starburst Mosquito Defense System is smart, it's fast, it's 1, 2, 3. But not only mosquitoes and other insects can be destroyed this way. You can adjust the system to destroy all irritating elements in your surroundings. For instance, the neighbor's cat. Or the neighbor's house. Or undesirable planets.
Now, the reason I've shown you that is it's not far off what you could do. You see, this revolution in laser technology has meant that some of these lasers are selling just for a few $1,000s now. And the sort of figure that people have calculated for really big volume production is something like $5 a watt. So work out how big a laser do you want? That's how much it's going to cost you. So for the first time, we're talking about an infinitely scalable laser technology. So here it is. Apparently the Americans pronounce this ponche. But it's a spatial beam combination actually on board a ship. So what does 28 kilowatts do? You know, the biggest threat that we face today is drones. You can go and you can buy them in your local model shop and you can fly them up to thousands of feet over the White House. It's been done. What's your defense against them? A laser system, obviously. That could take them out. And this has now become a big European project, and the Ministry of Defence in the UK has just put out a capability call for a 30 kilowatt system on the back of a Land Rover, which we could do. But there's lots of civilian ideas as well. The next accelerator for CERN, there's a thing that's called laser wake-field acceleration. I won't bore you with it, partly because I don't understand it myself. But you create a massive plasma along the beam and with a very short pulse. And so you have a wave of plasma which travels down at the speed of light, and the particles surf along the front of it. And this means that you could, according to the physicists, you could make an equivalent of CERN in 100 meters long. At the moment it's a 27 kilometer ring, Size of the ring goes up as the fourth power of the energy. If you want to double your energy, Switzerland isn't big enough. So this would lead us then possibly to nuclear fuel transmutation. What is that? You take fuel rods that have been highly radioactive, you radiate them with very high energy particles, and you can reduce the half-life down to a few years instead of hundreds of thousands of years. Perhaps a tabletop synchrotron, ion beam therapy, I'm sure you've heard about. But here's another interesting possibility. That appears to be the only practical way, as we know it today, to get rid of the small particles. You wouldn't do this for the big particles. The small ones, they're traveling at 10 times the speed of a bullet. You've got to track them, you've got to get rid of them. And that's not easy for these little particles. And there's one other final thing that I would like to leave you with before I perhaps wrap up with some knowledge and wisdom, I hope. We presented this 2015 was declared by UNESCO as the Year of Light, meaning light technologies, but also meaning lighting, art, and architecture. And we had a wrap-up meeting of this in Mexico, in Merida, and the reason it was there is that is where the 10-kilometer diameter meteorite hit the Earth 60 billion years ago, if I remember, and it is believed that that is what destroyed the dinosaurs. So we thought it would be appropriate, therefore, to write, because we found another use for silica, we can write documents into it in code, and we have shown through various accelerated tests that they will last for 1 billion years, which exceeds the expected life of the human race, the planet, who knows, but it will last that long. So we put the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into this piece of glass and presented it to UNESCO, and they absolutely freaked out. We are now about to donate the Magna Carta to Salisbury Cathedral to go alongside the copy that they have there, an indestructible copy. So, let me answer what you may or may not be ready to ask. What have I learned about creativity, invention, after 45 years in photonics? Well, the first thing I learned was the older I get, the better I was. So here is something that I thought very hard about this, because I often give this talk to sixth form colleges, and they always ask, how do you invent things? How are you different? How should we emulate what you and your team and others throughout the world have done to create this incredible internet? And so I came up with this: succeed in spite of management. This is me disrupting your kids for you, right? There's a very considerable truth in that simple statement. You see, management want uniformity. Our schools want uniformity. Our universities want uniformity. They do it in the name of efficiency. But how do you take people like me, who are basically renegades, who want to do something different? And the challenge really for our organizations is to create efficient organizations that also celebrate people with renegades, the people with crazy ideas. Sadly, That doesn't seem to happen much in the world. And the one company that seems to get this right is Google, because they don't care if they fail. Here's another great truth. Rome did not create a great empire by having meetings. They did it by killing all those who opposed them. If at first you don't succeed, destroy all evidence that you tried. Empower young minds before they become polluted. Who's polluting them? We are. Us older guys. We should be encouraging them to think outside the box. So here's something I gleaned. Try first, try often, and learn from your mistakes, because we don't live in an environment much these days where we are allowed to try things. You'll have the health and safety executive down on you. So typically what I get from my institute is, I say to them, try this. And I get a request back for £100,000 worth of equipment and safety equipment, and God knows what else, countless meetings. And I send it back to them and say, you could use a Bunsen burner and a nickel spoon. But we've created this kind of society which doesn't allow this to happen anymore. A successful experiment is worth 1,000 theories, and you can always make your lucky breaks look calculated afterwards, right? PowerPoint does not create things. Never be afraid to be wrong, or to admit it when you are. It takes a lot of courage to admit you were wrong. We live in societies which are hierarchical, and everybody's scrambling over everybody else. They don't want to appear wrong, but it's really important to be wrong. So the only ones you should be ashamed of are those where you think, oh my God, I'm thick, I should have really thought of that beforehand. And that's not often the case. Revisit your apparent failures often, because your timing is everything. If we'd had the low-loss fiber before the laser, nobody would have even thought about using it. It just was in the right time frame. People are everything. Be bold, recruit the best. You cannot make the world different, surrounded by indifferent people. You know how many people don't want to work with people brighter than themselves? That's been something I've done all my life. That's how I recruit people. I want somebody to be brighter than me, and then I will unashamedly take the credit for it. No, you know what I mean. And always work with people smarter than you are. Take calculated risks. Not that calculated, right? And so I wanted to wrap up by reintroducing to some of those heroes, because here they are. That's my wife, Vanessa, very tolerant lady. You have to have a tolerant partner if you're going to be a scientist or engineer. There is Charlie. I think this is the last time he was out in public. Down here is the only time Charles Cowell met with Charles Townes in Paris there, and this is Gwen, which is Charles' wife, who speaks for him now. This is, by the way, Gérard Mourou, who's very famous for having invented some of the technology that I was talking about. And this is an interesting one, because here is Cindy de Severe, and I introduce you to Emmanuel de Severe, and Kathleen Mayman, because, the tolerant partner part, I cannot overestimate it. Kathleen Mayman, remember he was the first practical demonstration of the laser. I introduced you to him earlier. He died about 5-6 years ago. She travels the world on his behalf, telling his story. So that's a wonderful thing, and let me finish then. Technology is fun, folks. I hope I've convinced you of that fact. Thank you for listening.